I've never advocated kicking anybody out of church. But I do advocate that if someone's going to murmur all the time, that they will not have me as an audience. How many of you got up this morning and counted your blessings? Okay. How many of you have murmured since you got up? Oh, wow. Okay. Now, this is going to be a participation sermon. I want you to write down 5 sins. Doesn't matter what 5, just 5 sins. First 5 sins that you think of. And while you're doing that, I'll make a comment. I think it's not strange, but it's just the way life is. When we have a blessing, we usually acknowledge that blessing privately. We just think, yeah, I'm glad I got a good wife. I'm glad it's raining today. But boy, if we've got something to murmur about, we just go person to person to person. It's just on and on and on and on. Now, 5 sins. You've written them down. Look at that list of sins. If you have committed any one of those sins, put a check or a dot by each sin that you personally have committed. Now, you know what's interesting psychologically? When people make a list of sin, when believers make a list of sin, most of us make a list of sin by which later we will not put a dot because we focus on the sins of others. And when we focus on the sins of others, that doesn't make us perceptive. Not at all. That means we are judgmental, bigoted, self-righteous. Pharisees were great at pointing out sins of others. I mean, they could tell you exactly, precisely what someone else did that was wrong. They even went up to Jesus and said, "Hey, buddy, let me tell you what you just did that was wrong." Who would dare do that to the Son of God? Now, the reason they could do that is because they had reduced sin to a list of things to do and a list of things not to do. And I got news for you. That's not it. And that's why we get ourselves in such a dilemma at times. I don't know if this is right or if this is wrong, and out of that emerges the situation ethics. Sin is not to be reduced to a list. Sin is a relationship with God and with other people. Let's go back to when Moses struck the rock. And then God reprimands him. And remember how God reprimanded Moses? He said, "You did not trust me enough to honor me. You did not trust me enough to obey me." God said it's not the specific rule, but it's, I told you what to do, and you did it another way. Did you think that I wouldn't bring water out of the rock if you just spoke? Were you just wanting to rebel and ignore my word? Do you know how that hurts my heart? God says, "Moses, it's about a relationship. I want you to trust me." That's why it's called the Promised Land. And I got to tell you, if you don't trust God, you're not going to go to heaven. There is nothing in the world that you can do to get to heaven short of trusting God. And if you trust God to save you, you've got to trust God all along the way to be there when you fail, to be there when you're in need, to reprimand you when you're wrong. So God began with that little artificial signs of sin, someone with a skin disease or a cut or whatever. And he said, you know what to do with that, but let's move on to a little bit higher level. Let's look at some spiritual signs of sin. Verse 5, again, the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, when a man or woman wrongs another in any way and so is unfaithful to God. Notice now that God says when a man or woman sins, that sin is against me. That person is unfaithful to the Lord. That person is guilty and must confess the sin he has committed. He must make full restitution for his wrong, add 1/5 to it, and give it all to the person he has wronged. But if that person has no close relative to whom restitution can be made for the wrong, the restitution belongs to the Lord, must be given to the priest. Verse 5 says, all sin is against God. And our only sin against God is when we violate our relationship with Him. Every time that you make the decision in your life that God doesn't want you to make, you have sinned against that relationship because He is Lord of your life. Every time you disobey God, you have sinned against that relationship because He's Lord. You see, when sinners began to deal with sin and we move into the judgment seat and we define sin, the costs are insurmountable. And forgiveness is next to impossible. Have you ever gone to someone and said, hey, I'm really sorry, forgive me, and the person looks at you and says, well, I don't know, I'm hurt. It's going to take me a while to get through this. Now, you show me in the Bible where that's justifiable. Show me one place in the Bible where God folds His hands and says, I'm hurt, and it's going to take me a while to get through this, or work through this, get back with me maybe in a few weeks. Let me think about it. Let me pray about it. Let me work out the details. No, when God defines sin, there's still a cost. But forgiveness is immediate. He talks about making restitution. We have this idea about sin that if we do something wrong, all we have to do is say, my bad. I'm sorry. Oops. No. What the Scripture says is if you take $100 from somebody, you give them $120. That's restitution. The root word means to be captive. And whenever we sin, we are taken into sin's captivity. How can you pay that $20 that you don't have to go with $100 that you stole? How can you get back someone's reputation when you've already destroyed it? Going up to that person saying, I'm sorry, I thought it was the truth, I wouldn't have told anyone. Does that help? Does that change? Absolutely not. That's why the Son of God died on the cross, to make restitution for our sin. If it were simply paying the price back, most of us could come up with it in some form or fashion, but we can't do that. And that's the point God was making even back in the Old Testament. When you sin against someone, you cannot just make it right, because sin takes us captive. And then the chapter closes with what I call the hidden signs of sin.